Hi students, and welcome to our next lecture here on Mesopotamia. Our essential question that we're dealing with today is, what were the important characteristics of the civilizations in Mesopotamia? Before we go on, I want you to think about the Neolithic Revolution that we just studied and why it was such a big deal. Why was it that when we're coming off an ice age, we're going to have climate change that's going to make uh, the temperatures warmer, the oceans rise? Why is that going to create something so different and usher in the beginnings of civilization? I also want you to think about the 5 characteristics of a civilization. Which one do you think is the most important? We're going to focus a little bit on the advanced technologies of the river valley civilizations here because that is one of your potential topics for Gateway this year. So when we're talking about river valley civilizations, we're talking about Mesopotamia, we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about China, and we're talking about India. Now remember, these are really considered to be the world's first 4 civilizations, occurring around 3500 to 2000 BCE, or before the Common Era, and they are river systems. Why do you think people are settling around rivers? What do rivers provide us? Now, when we're talking about our first region, Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia means the land between the waters, and the rivers that gave life to this region were the Tigris and the Euphrates. So when we talk about river valley civilizations, remember it's the discovery of farming that is going to lead us to settling into civilizations. People are no longer going to have to be nomadic. Remember, when we had food surpluses, that's going to allow us to have specialized workers. We're going to start keeping records. We're going to start creating complex institutions like religion and government. And of course, we're going to develop advanced technology. Now, the world's first civilizations all began in the river valleys. And you see here, we see the Tigris and the Euphrates here. That's going to be Mesopotamia. We see the Nile River Valley here, Egypt. We see the Indus River, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, all the Indian civilizations. And finally, we see the Wang He, or the Yellow River, and the Changjiang, or the Yangtze River. And that's going to give us China. So remember, the first one we're going to talk about here is going to be our Mesopotamian civilization, known as Sumeria and Babylonia, right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here. So between 3500 and 2350 BCE, the first true civilization in Mesopotamia was begun by the Sumerians. And as time passed, a variety of other local groups, especially the Babylonians, will come to power. They will achieve political dominance over the region, but still the language, the culture, and the religious traditions of the Sumerians will influence all of the peoples of Mesopotamia for centuries to come. Now, the people of Mesopotamia built many cities, including the famous urban center of Babylon, and created a society governed by a small ruling class of priests and a king-like figure known as the Lugal, which literally means big man. Mesopotamia was not always politically centralized. As a matter of fact, the Sumerians were known to have city-states, just like the Greeks later on. And these individual city-states enjoyed relative autonomy. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers will flood once a year, and it's going to leave behind fertile soil ideal for farming. Again, Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, and it's often called the Fertile Crescent, or as we know it, the cradle of civilization. So when we have ISIS, who is destroying all of these wonderful ancient cities, like Nineveh and all the other things in Iraq and Syria that they are destroying, they're really destroying the history of mankind. And as someone who loves world history, that's just appalling to me. Okay, so the first civilization will develop in the Fertile Crescent, and it is called Sumer. You probably remembered reading something about the Epic of Gilgamesh, or if you haven't read it, you might get that your sophomore year. I'm not sure what they're doing in language arts these days. But anyway, the surrounding deserts and the lack of natural barriers will attract outsiders to Mesopotamia, and that's going to make them vulnerable to attack, but it's also going to allow them to trade. So if we look at Mesopotamia's timeline with Sumer, we see that nomadic herders are going to be raiding the Sumerian city-states. We see the Sumerians gaining fame as traders. We see that each city-state has its own army and leader, and of course, they all want to conquer each other. And then finally, in 2900 BC, Semitic herders are going to seize the city-states in northern Sumer, and that's going to give rise to the Akkadians. So here we have different political forces controlling it, and of course they're all going to name their kingdom something different here. So we've got from 1813 to 1781 BC, Assyria will control Upper Mesopotamia by force. Then we're going to have Hammurabi, the leader of Babylonia, who will conquer most of Assyria, and then after Hammurabi dies, Babylonia will fade away. We see the development of copper and tin, which will be used for bronze weapons. And we also see under Hammurabi, though, a very important thing, the development of the world's first legal code. Hammurabi's law code was very harsh. Death and mutilation were common punishments, and favored the upper classes, but the idea that a systematic, consistent set of regulations rather than the arbitrary will of a ruler should govern society was an important innovation. This was a completely new idea. Another thing about Mesopotamia is that the people were very skilled builders and craftspeople. So they used clay as their primary building materials, and they erected dozens of large cities. To honor their many gods and goddesses, they constructed large pyramid temples called ziggurats. They built canals and dams. They were accomplished at pottery and metalworking, and bronze working itself begins around 3000 BCE. And the Sumerians and Babylonians were also very skilled astronomers. They developed a high level of mathematical knowledge, and they originated the base 60 number system that is still used today to measure time and navigational calculations. The people of Mesopotamia were great traders, and their economic network extended throughout the Middle East as well as North Africa, the Indian Ocean, and maybe even the Indian subcontinent there. So with the Babylonians here, remember the important thing to remember about Babylonians is King Hammurabi and the Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye. Next in line, we have the Hittites. They are going to come over from Ur to Canaan. Here's Ur. Here's Canaan. So they're going to travel up the Euphrates River and come on over into Canaan, where they have Bethel and Jericho. Famine forces Hebrews to move to Egypt, and that's where they're eventually going to become slaves. And then Moses is going to lead them from Egypt back to Canaan. Remember, if you've never watched the Ten Commandments, it's a great movie to watch. I especially like the one with Charlton Heston. It's really, really, really old, but it continues to remain good. Where he allegedly parts the Red Sea and marches his people to Canaan. So the Hebrews will reach Canaan and form a kingdom. Next up, we have the Phoenicians. Phoenician traders will colonize the Western Mediterranean. When their homeland falls to Assyria, they will, essentially be absolved into Assyria. However, they left lasting impressions upon the world because it is their alphabet which is introduced to the Greeks. And what was so interesting about their alphabet is that this was the first time phonetic sounds came into a language rather than just symbols like cuneiform and hieroglyphics. So the Phoenician alphabet is probably their most important contribution to history, and it survives to this day in our own form of writing. Again, they were great traders. They helped to colonize the Western Mediterranean by bringing goods through Asia and also through Africa. Carthage becomes the center of Phoenician civilization. And one of the great leaders of Carthage was Hannibal. And when we get into Rome, you'll learn a little bit more about the wars between Carthage and Italy. Carthage and Rome. Here's Carthage, here's Rome. What do you think they were going to fight over? I'll give you a clue. It's this big buddy right here, the Mediterranean Sea. So now let's go back a little bit and let's talk about Sumer. Sumerian city-states were protected by the high walls, as you can see here, and at the center of their city center is a temple called the ziggurat. And I want you to think about how the ziggurat is different than the pyramid, not only in design, but also in purpose. So in Mesopotamia, they also had specialized workers. At the top of society were the priests and then the kings. And in the middle were the skilled workers like merchants. And at the bottoms were the common farmers and slaves. One thing about the advent of specialized workers is that it's going to open up societies to create class systems. We also had complex institutions, religions. Both the Sumerians and the Babylonians were polytheistic. Remember, poly meaning they worshipped more than one god. The Hebrews in Palestine were the first monotheist faith in history. That was Judaism. And the holy book of Judaism is the Torah. And God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, which serve as the Jewish moral laws. Along with complex institutions, we also have rulers creating written law codes like Hammurabi's Code of Law. And as you can see, many, many, many gods of ancient Mesopotamia here. So when we talk about complex institutions and we talk about law codes, we not only have the 10 Commandments that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai that served the basis for Jewish laws, but we also have King Hammurabi's first legal code, Hammurabi's Code, which had 282 laws based on justice and retaliation, an eye for an eye. And there were different punishments for the different levels of society. So not everybody was created equally, but everybody was subject to the law. And there's a few different laws here that you can see. Among lasting contributions, we also have the development of the world's first writing system from the Sumerians called cuneiform. And these were the little wedge-shaped symbols that we saw. The Phoenicians simplified cuneiform to a 22-letter alphabet, and their merchants spread the alphabet through the Mediterranean world. And like I said, this alphabet was based on sounds, so it heavily influences Greek, Latin, and English. Here you see some Sumerian cuneiform, keeping records of something, I suppose. There we see the lasting contributions of the Phoenicians. They developed a round boat, a ship that was very wide and had a rounded bottom. This creates a large space for cargo, which helps them to become some of the world's preeminent traders at this time in history. Their ships were often decorated with horse heads, much like the Vikings with their dragon ships. You have a wicker fence that runs around the outer edge of the upper deck. Foreigners wanted the cedar wood, so they also transported that. They had pottery jars that held oil or wine, but the most desired Phoenician trade item was dyed red-purple cloth. and they made that from snail slime. Pretty interesting, huh? Okay, when we talk about technology, remember, River Valley technology is going to be potentially one of your gateway topics, so we will be doing a small gateway practice on this. So the Sumerian inventions include the wheel, the sail, the plow, and bronze metalwork. And I want you to be thinking about how these tools made their lives easier, and more importantly, how they still continue to make our lives easier today. You know, how did we, I guess, advance these? Did we advance these? So be thinking about how advanced technology helps make your life easier and how it made lives easier way back in the day. So our closure activity for this unit is going to be developing a Hammurabi's code for our classroom. I want you to think about important things that are going to keep order in our classroom. What do we need to do to make sure that we have a good learning environment, that it's a pleasant place to be? But obviously we can't be all wild, so I want you to be thinking about what we can be doing, because you're going to be coming into class and working with your partner and in your family groups to develop a potential code for our very own classroom. And that will conclude this lecture, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you took all of your notes.